In the year 1004 AD, a Viking captain named Thorvald lay dying on a beach in North America. He wasn't killed by an English knight or a French cavalryman or another Viking rival. He was killed by an enemy his people had never seen before, an enemy who didn't fight for gold or land or kings. As Thorvald pulled the stone arrow from under his arm, he looked out at the massive, endless forest of the New World and realized a terrifying truth. The Vikings, the deadliest warriors in Europe, the men who burned Paris and conquered England, were not the predators here. They were the prey. We are taught that Columbus discovered America. We are taught that the Vikings were unstoppable berserkers who feared nothing. Both of those are lies. The Vikings did find America 500 years before Columbus. They built houses, they forged iron, they birthed children, and then they ran away. They didn't leave because of the cold. They left because they met a warrior culture that broke them. This is the untold story of Vinland, and the only war the Vikings ever truly lost. To understand the panic, you have to understand the arrogance. 4 years before Thorvald died, his brother Leif Erikson had done the impossible. He sailed west into the void. Most sailors at the time hugged the coasts. Leif sailed straight into open ocean. And what he found wasn't just land, it was a paradise compared to the freezing rocks of Greenland. First he found Helluland, stone slab land, desolate rock, likely modern-day Baffin Island. Then Markland, forest land, endless timber, and finally, Vinland. The sagas tell us the rivers were choked with salmon larger than they had ever seen. The dew on the grass tasted sweet. There were vines of wild grapes. For a Norseman coming from the starvation of Greenland, this wasn't just exploration. This was survival. Leif built a settlement, Leifsbudir. They spent a winter there. It was perfect. The days were long. The frost didn't freeze the grass. It was a kingdom waiting to be taken. But Leif made one critical mistake. He assumed the land was empty. When Leif sailed home a hero, his brother Thorvald said the job wasn't finished. He said, "This land has not been explored enough." He took 30 men and returned to claim Vinland. But the forest was watching them. It started with curiosity. Thorvald and his men were exploring a fjord when they spotted 3 humps on the beach. As they got closer, they realized they were boats, hide canoes, flipped over. Underneath each boat were 3 men. The Norse called them Skrælings. It's a derogatory word meaning wretches or shriveled skin. It shows you exactly what the Vikings thought of them. They saw them as weak, primitive. The Vikings did what Vikings always did. They captured 8 of the men and slaughtered them on the spot, just because they could. One man escaped. He ran into the trees, and Thorvald, arrogant in his iron armor, thought nothing of it. He went back to his ship and fell asleep. But the sagas tell of a voice that woke them in the middle of the night, a voice that screamed, "Wake up, Thorvald, if you wish to save your life." The water turned black with canoes, hundreds of them. The Skrælings hadn't run away in fear. They had mobilized. The Vikings formed a shield wall, the tactic that shattered English armies. But the indigenous warriors didn't fight like Europeans. They didn't charge the shield wall. They unleashed a storm of arrows and slingstones. They moved fast, using the terrain, peppering the heavy Norse ships. It was over in minutes. The Vikings, panicked by the sheer number of enemies, retreated. Thorvald was the only casualty. An arrow flew between the gunwale of the ship and his shield, striking his armpit. His last words were a dark joke. "We have found a rich land, but we will not enjoy it." They buried him there, with crosses at his head and feet. The first European king of America was a corpse. You would think this would stop them. It didn't. 2 years later, a wealthy merchant named Thorfinn Karlsefni arrived. And he didn't bring just warriors, he brought families. He brought livestock. He brought 160 people to build a permanent colony. At first, the locals returned, but this time they didn't attack. They wanted to trade. The sagas describe a bizarre scene. The indigenous people wanted Viking weapons, iron swords and spears. Karlsefni forbade it. Instead, they traded red cloth for valuable furs. The Vikings cut the cloth into smaller and smaller strips as they ran out, and the locals still paid a fortune for it. It seemed like peace was possible, until the bull got loose. The Vikings had brought a bull from Europe. The natives had never seen a creature this massive. One day the bull broke loose and roared. The sound was so alien, so terrifying to the locals, that they dropped their goods and fled. They stayed away for 3 weeks. The Vikings thought they were safe. They weren't. The locals weren't hiding, they were gathering an army. When they returned, it wasn't to trade. The sagas describe a weapon that historians still can't explain. The attackers hoisted a large, dark sphere on a pole and launched it over the Viking heads. When it hit the ground, it made a terrifying noise, like a bomb. The Vikings broke. These men who had faced death 100 times panicked. They turned and ran. The great warriors were fleeing, but one person didn't run. Freydis Eiríksdóttir, the sister of Leif Erikson, and she was heavily pregnant. She saw her countrymen retreating and screamed at them, "Why do you run from these wretches when you should slaughter them like cattle? If I had a weapon, I would fight better than any of you." The men ignored her. They left her behind. The indigenous warriors closed in. Freydis couldn't run. She was too slow. So she grabbed a sword from a dead Viking. She turned to face the army. She ripped open her tunic, exposing her breast, and slapped the flat of the sword against her chest, screaming a battle cry. It was a display of madness so pure, so terrifying, that the attackers stopped. They had never seen anything like it. They retreated to their boats. A pregnant woman had saved the colony, but the message was clear. That night, the Vikings made a choice. Karlsefni realized something profound. Although the land is excellent, we will live here in constant fear and warfare. Their iron swords were better, their shields were stronger, but they were 160 people on the edge of a continent filled with millions of potential enemies. They were outnumbered, isolated, and terrified. They packed their ships, they took the grapes, the timber, and the furs, and they left. They sailed back to Greenland, leaving Vinland to the forest and the people who knew how to defend it. Europe wouldn't return for another 500 years. The Vikings had conquered England. They had raided Spain. They had served the emperors of Byzantium. But in America? In America, they learned that even the dragon has to run sometimes.